David Broder, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, national correspondent for the Washington Post. He joined the Post in 1966 and quickly became one of our most respected political journalists. And since then, week in, week out, year in, year out, he's earned that respect, commanded that respect over again. Most of you follow Mr. Broder's column from the Washington Post. It's in our own Ann Arbor News. Most of you will know him from NBC's Meet the Press, where in August he made his 400th appearance, eclipsing by far any other guest on that distinguished program. And in my own household, where 8 p.m. Friday for years has meant Washington Week on PBS, and at one time meant leave Dad alone right now, I confess that I always give a silent cheer when I see that Mr. Broder is one of the guest discusser panelists. And this being a university campus, it's also a pleasure to note that Mr. Broder is a tenured professor at the University of Maryland's College of Journalism. David Broder covered his first presidential campaign in 1960, and for decades he regarded it as the best campaign he ever saw, but not anymore. That distinction now goes to 2008, he recently wrote. And now, to hear more about that, I present you with Mr. Broder. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great honor.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate your welcome, and I really am delighted to be back on this campus. I came here the first time, I think, in that 1960 campaign, and have been back many, many times since then, and I really look forward to the conversation part of our evening this evening. It is a great honor to be here at the Ford Library. I've covered 11 presidents now, and without any qualification, I would say the one who was the most genuine and appealing human being of all of the 11 was your own Jerry Ford. He never changed once he went behind the fence at the White House, which is remarkable because something about that location really does tend to bend most of the occupants out of shape in one way or another. But he had the character and the Midwest values so down by the time he got to the White House that he was absolutely immune to that kind of folly or fantasy or whatever the right word is. But I valued my friendship with him and Betty Ford, and I really am honored to be here in his library this evening. I was asked to talk a little bit about this campaign that we've just finished, which I'm very happy to do because, as David said, it turned out to be an absolute barn burner of an election and a wonderful one to cover. At one point this past summer, I said to Don Graham, my boss at the Post, I would have paid you, Don, to cover this one instead of the other way around. And he said, well, I'd like to take you up on that. On that. You know what's happening to newspaper budgets these days. But what made it special was, I think, several things. One, the simple cast of characters, the candidates that we had, particularly at the start of this year. It's hard to remember back, but when this year began, there were 10 or a dozen people running on each side, and they were not slouches. This was a remarkable group of men and women running this year in both parties, and it clearly was partly that attracted so much enthusiasm from the voters. I think it was also the fact that this year, like 1960, people knew in advance that thanks to the Constitution, we were going to be choosing a new president. And when you have that anticipation, there's always an additional element of excitement about who is going to come out of this as the new president. But without trying to go back and rehearse the whole process, which I don't want to take the time to do, I think it's worth spending a few minutes just on the three people who ultimately came to dominate this year's political news: John McCain, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama. I've known John McCain since he first came to the House of Representatives from Arizona, and like every other reporter that I know, have been intrigued by and charmed by that wonderful man. We all knew the story of his captivity and the courage and absolute unbreakable spirit that he demonstrated in those 5 years that he was locked up in Hanoi. But we also know that as a member of Congress, and particularly in the Senate, he was perhaps the paragon of what it means to be an independent political force, and did so in a way that I think was so engaging because he never took himself all that seriously and had the kind of perspective on the quarrels, the arguments, the debates that he was part of in the Congress. Having lived the life that he had led, he knew that there were worse things than losing a vote or losing a campaign, and made it very clear that he had his own values that were going to be driving him rather than some other pollster, pundit, or consultant telling him what he needed to do. He's a remarkable man, and I think the fact that we're getting him back now in the Senate is a blessing for the country, because he will be a real force in the United States Senate. Hillary Clinton, I got to know when her husband was governor of Arkansas, and then covered pretty closely when she was the First Lady in the first 2 years of that presidency, when she and her husband were attempting to do their version of health care reform. I have to say, because I wrote it with my friend Haynes Johnson in an exceptionally long and boring book about that fight, but I thought that there were a lot of times in that fight where she missed her cues. There was a sense that she conveyed to people, particularly in Congress at that point, that she knew better than anybody else what needed to be done, and if you all would just shut up and listen to me, we could actually get something done here. I came away thinking that in a certain respect, she was politically tone deaf at that point, but she has never stopped growing in terms of her talents and abilities, and particularly her political sensitivities. In Iowa, at the start of this year, she was not a particularly good candidate. And watching her there was a kind of an awkwardness to her interactions with the Iowa voters. But as time went on, she got better and better and better. And at the end of the campaign, I thought she was making speeches and doing events that were at least as good, maybe in some respects better than those of Barack Obama. And I don't know where she will wind up in this administration or in the Senate if she chooses to remain in the Senate. But she will be a force in this country over the next years to come without any question at all. And of course, the real story this year turned out to be Barack Obama. And I feel lucky because through pure chance, I met him and his wife about 10 years ago. I was out in Chicago. I can't even remember what had taken me there, but I was having lunch one day with a man that we've all come to know quite well now, David Axelrod, who was the political consultant in Chicago and one of my regular sort of check-in with Axelrod when you're in Chicago kind of people. And we were having lunch this day, and he said to me, "Do you know Barack Obama?" And I said, "No, who is Barack Obama?" And his answer was, "Well, he's in the state Senate, but he's not going to be a state senator forever. You ought to get to know him." I took the advice seriously, and when I got back to the hotel that afternoon, I called Obama's Senate office in Chicago, and it turned out by chance that he was actually in Chicago at that point, not down in Springfield where the legislature meets. And we arranged to have lunch together the next day. Michelle Obama came up from University of Chicago, where she was working in the clinics at that point, to join us. And I have to say, I was just blown away by this young couple, by her at least as much as by him. And when I got back again to the hotel that afternoon, I called Axelrod and I said, "I can see why you are excited about this guy and this couple." And I never covered him in his Illinois races after that, but I followed them because I was obviously interested in it after having that early exposure to them. And then when he came to the Senate, began to stop by there and visit from time to time, as I do with senators from both parties. But I'd never seen him as a campaigner until Iowa. And I went my first trip to Iowa about a year ago now, just before Thanksgiving in 2007. And what I saw of Obama in Iowa was a revelation. I went with him to several of the small town events that he was doing in Iowa. And it was very, very clear. You would have to have been deaf and dumb not to recognize what was happening. He was taking strangers and by force of personality and intellect, converting them into enthusiastic supporters in meeting after meeting. And the other thing that I learned on that trip to Iowa, because I went on a Saturday afternoon, he brought Oprah in for the first time to build the crowd, and they had 18,000 people in a big auditorium in downtown Des Moines. No chairs, people standing for a couple hours to watch the show. And the next day, on a Sunday afternoon, I drove down to the Obama headquarters in Des Moines to see what they were doing with all of these cards with names, email addresses, and phone numbers that they had collected from the 18,000 people. And what I found was a crew of young people working in that headquarters on a Sunday afternoon, sorting the cards by geographical area. And the guy who was the field director for Obama in Iowa said to me, "We will distribute these before the afternoon is over to our local headquarters, and the phoning will begin tonight," which told me that not only were they beginning to really pull the crowds with the personalities that Obama and his friends could deploy, but they knew exactly what to do with all of that information and were going to be very, very formidable. Well, they won Iowa, which was not a surprise to me, but New Hampshire was a terrific shock. I thought that having won Iowa, he would certainly win New Hampshire, which is a more upscale and educated electorate, and I thought made to order for Obama. But Hillary Clinton, to her credit, took 5 days that she had there and turned that state around. And an amazing thing. And then, of course, we saw what happened after that, which was the endless campaign with one beating the other and the other coming back and turning it around. The question that I suppose preoccupied most of us in the press about the Obama campaign was a question based on his parentage and race. Would America really vote for a black man? We did not know the answer to that question. I thought, from what I had seen in Iowa, that the chances were that it would not be a fatal barrier for him. But I certainly didn't know that in advance. But what we did find out was that when the Reverend Wright surfaced and made those remarkably inflammatory statements, Barack Obama, by himself, 3 nights of late night writing, wrote a speech about race in America that I think will become a classic for this generation. It's certainly the strongest statement about that subject that we've heard from anyone since Martin Luther King, and was an amazing feat in terms of being able to take what could have been a terrible, terrible personal problem and lifting it to a level where it became a guide to Americans of all races as to how to think about this classic American tragedy of race and in our own time. And from that point on, I thought it was pretty clear that whatever happened in the election, it was not going to be decided by racial animus towards a black candidate. But the other thing that clearly happened was that John McCain, for his sins, inherited perhaps the toughest political environment that any Republican has had to face for a very long time. The president's lack of popularity and support, the uncertainty about what was going to happen in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then finally, after September 15th, this sudden and shocking collapse of the economy. I don't believe that there was any Republican who could have been elected this year under those conditions. And in some respects, McCain came closer perhaps than anybody else could have. I want to jump quickly now to talking a little bit speculatively about the implications of this remarkable election that we've just been through. One of the advantages, I guess, of having done this beat as long as I've done it, is that you learn not to go overboard in interpreting any single election. I mean, I can remember some of the nonsense that I wrote and others wrote after the '64 election, where Barry Goldwater lost by a landslide to Lyndon Johnson. And some of us really wondered at that point whether the Republican Party would be able to survive. Well, 4 years later, Richard Nixon took the Republicans right back to the White House. In 1988, after the Democrats had lost the White House 3 times in a row, there were questions raised about whether there was now a permanent Republican electoral majority. Well, Bill Clinton, 4 years later in '92, took the Democrats back to the White House. So given how loosely most Americans now hold their party ties, and given the large numbers of Americans who simply refuse to identify themselves with either party, the volatility in our politics and public opinion just simply cannot be exaggerated. So I don't assume that we've got some kind of a permanent Democratic majority in Washington at this point. But there are things that you can see now in the results from this election that, at a very minimum, pose a challenge to the Republicans and could conceivably, if the Republicans don't respond intelligently, could lead to a longer-term Democratic majority. What am I thinking about? I'm thinking about, first of all, the fact that Barack Obama broke the solid South. The Republican base has been the South ever since Ronald Reagan's time. And that has been an absolutely solid base for them until this year. And this year, my home state of Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida, where I was over the weekend, all went to Barack Obama. That is very significant. What happened in the Middle West was very significant. Ohio, the classic battleground state, Indiana, my wife's home state, which she never believed would vote for Barack Obama, but did, and Iowa, which was not that much of a surprise, came back to the Democrats after being in Bush's corner 4 years ago. And finally, and significantly, in the mountain states, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, all went for Barack Obama. So that's 3 separate areas of the country which had been part of the Republican base, which were broken this time. And that is a potentially significant change. Young people voted very large numbers for Obama. And we know that that's significant because the first vote that you cast sometimes puts an imprint on you and makes you more inclined to keep voting that way. And the Democrats had not won the young vote in any other recent election. African Americans and Hispanics. I quoted a Republican consultant the other day who said in these words, as long as we Republicans lose 95% of the African American vote and 67% of the Hispanic vote, we will not win another national election. That's a pretty strong statement. But the point particularly about Hispanics is important because that implies not just outreach as necessary for Republicans, it also probably is going to require them to rethink the position that particularly on the House side, but also to some extent on the Senate, they took on this issue of immigration. The good news for the Republicans is that while there has been a genuine turning away from the Republicans' picture in Washington, D.C., at the state level, it's a very, very different picture. In California, in Texas, in Florida, you have popular Republican governors in states that are part of the emerging national majority. Those are states that you can build a base for a national campaign if you govern the way that the Texas and the California and Florida governors are governing, not the way that they've been operating in the Republicans in Washington, D.C. And there are many other really talented Republican governors now governing states successfully, from Bobby Jindal in Louisiana to Tim Pawlenty in Minnesota. That is where the Republicans can genuinely look for answers if they can figure out how to move what's happening at the state level and make that the basis for their operations at the national level. Meanwhile, Barack Obama and the Democrats now inherit all the problems that made life so miserable for John McCain during the campaign. Every single challenge that faces this country now is the responsibility of the Democratic leadership at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. And as you know, they're wrestling now with what to do about the crisis in the auto industry, and they will be wrestling soon with how to put together a budget where they've already run a deficit of probably $1 trillion this year. They will be wrestling with what to do about Iraq and Afghanistan. All of these issues now become the testing point for this Democratic government. And it's going to be a fascinating story to watch, probably as exciting a story as the campaign. And I'm lucky to be able to watch this one as well. Thank you very much.
I have a question about corruption and campaign finance reform. I read in the Wall Street Journal just about last Christmas or Christmas and New Year's about the hundreds and thousands of dollars that the mortgage industry was giving to Chris Dodd and the other senators and so forth. And and then came the meltdown in the mortgage industry. Does anybody care about this issue? And if so, who? And who? And three, what can people do about that? Because I think we've got to have, it's just too corrupt there. That they're buying senators, and there's no other way for the senators to earn their money to get reelected. And ditto the House of Representatives.
Well, people do care about it, but I'm not sure that I'd be honest with you if I told you that something's going to change very rapidly. The trend has been to move away from any form of public financing. We had it in the presidential race for 4 cycles. But this year, Barack Obama said, no, I'm not going to constrain myself to public financing. I'm going to raise a lot more money on my own, and did so. And I'm afraid that the implication of that will be that people who are ambitious for the White House will in the future say, I'm going to do what Obama did and just go out and raise as much money as I can possibly let my hands on. The Congress has never adopted public financing for itself, and so you have the spectacle of the kind that you talked about. Chris Dodd is a senator from Connecticut, where a lot of insurers and financial firms are headquartered. He has raised his campaign money from that industry, and now he finds himself as the chairman of that committee in the Senate, and is obviously going to be influenced by those who have been financing his campaigns. I don't know how we break this cycle. I wish I had a good answer to give you, but I do think that there is public concern about it because people can see that it is a distorting force in our politics and in our government.
I'm wondering if you see any sense that Congress will finally become a viable, powerful, equal partner in government. Right now, we've got a very powerful, efficient commander-in-chief. We've got a financial bailout that is directly under the Secretary of the Treasury, who is responsible only to the president. We've got signing agreements. We've got all kinds of things. We're going to have a very powerful president. I wonder if Congress, if you see, since you've got your pulse on the, you've got your finger on the pulse, if you think that Congress is going to stand up and really be 1/3 of our federal government.
Thank you for that question. I think I am guardedly optimistic about the forces in Congress. The campaign produced several new senators and about 20 new representatives. And as far as I can judge from what I read about them, and in some cases meeting them on the campaign trail, they got a very clear sense from their constituents about how frustrated the American people are, Republicans or Democrats, with the performance or the lack of performance in this last Congress. People are really fed up with the kind of spectacle that we've seen of excessive partisanship, fighting back and forth rather than dealing with real concerns. I think they got that message, and I am, with fingers crossed, hopeful that it will begin to reflect now in the way in which they present themselves. I think both Obama and McCain were serious about wanting to reduce the level of partisanship and increase the civility and conversation level across party lines in Washington. And I believe that they will try to do that, both of them. I think Obama from his end and McCain from his end will really try to do that. So with a little bit of luck, we may actually get a better climate in the Congress. There will still be all kinds of issues where parochial concerns and kind of influence of interest groups and financial backers will still be a barrier to legislation. But if we can actually get people talking to each other across party lines, that would be a big improvement over what we've seen in recent years.
What was your feeling about Sarah Palin and her, whether she was a positive or negative force in McCain's campaign, and what do you envision for the future in national politics, because she hardly fits the template of the governors that you were talking about?
You're absolutely right. I've been kicking myself ever since Senator McCain announced that she would be his running mate, because I go regularly to the governors' conferences. Twice a year they meet, and in an act of remarkable stupidity, I never sat down to interview Governor Palin. So I have been operating in the blind without having ever having any background in who this lady is or what she's really like. What I saw at the Republican convention in St. Paul was very clear a highly polished, professional speech-making job that thrilled the Republican hardcore, the delegates who were there, and I think their counterparts around the country. What I also know, because at one point in October, I went to Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, a classic swing vote area that generally decides who's going to win the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in a statewide race. And what I heard there was over and over again that after McCain picked Palin, I couldn't vote for McCain again. These are the educated, independent swing voters there. One woman said to me, and I'll give you a kind of taste of what it was like, she said that she couldn't vote to put Palin in that close to the presidency, and I said, why not? And she said, well, she drops all her G's. Pretty snobbish statement in some respects, but there's no question that among the independent voters, and particularly the well-educated independents, this was not a helpful development for McCain. And I don't know her well enough to, she clearly has the ambition to run again and run for the top job next time. Whether she has the ability to master the national issues that she had no familiarity with when she began this campaign, I just simply don't know. I would guess that she probably does. And I would think that we will see her again 4 years from now.
Obama's putting together, and also just give your opinion of so many of the Clinton appointees. Thank you.
Well, the Clinton appointees are there because if you want people who have had some experience and you want some Democrats in your administration, there's only one place basically now where they could have had that experience, and that's during the Clinton administration. So I think this is an inevitability, and my guess is that as he continues to fill jobs, we'll see more of a mix. I mean, I've been surprised that in terms of timing, he put all of these Clinton people out front so early in the game. But that there were going to be Clinton people was not a surprise in itself. I don't know where he will go for the cabinet, and I've over the years been wrong often enough about rumors and speculation that I don't think it's the most useful kind of reporting at this point. When he's ready to announce something, he will announce it, as he did today with the Attorney General job. And as far as I can judge, we're making news here. I didn't. Huh? Is the co-chairman of his vetting, vice presidential vetting committee, who was a number 2 or number 3 man in the Justice Department in the Clinton administration, will now be the Attorney General, African American, and a very bright guy. So we've got a good Attorney General, I think, coming in. Eric Holder is his name. Yes.
Mr. Broder, I'm appearing in the only library of a president ever elected from the state of Michigan. Unfortunately, on the Republican Party ticket for myself, the Democratic Party delegate and Democrat from Washtenaw County that surrounds Ann Arbor. appearing before you with a campaign button on it from Obama picturing FDR, JFK, and Senator Barack Obama. And I'm asking a question because you're here, as you should know, on a day that may well determine the future of the state of Michigan, of the entire nation, as far as not only the automobile industry, but our economy, our place in the world economies in the future. We are at a crisis, albeit this audience may be filled with people not personally touched by the crisis that this state is in. I would like to know if, from your meeting, interviewing, and observation of President-elect Obama, is he prepared, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt was prepared upon taking oath of office within the first 100 days of his administration, to tackle these very serious problems? And do you think that even because of the seriousness of these interrelated problems involving access to housing, access to jobs, to health care, access to the American way of life, that he should not press right now as President-elect for Congress to act? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and I think you do not exaggerate the seriousness of the crisis that faces not just this state, but this country. I cannot imagine, and it perhaps is a reflection of my advanced years, but I cannot imagine America without a healthy auto industry of its own. It's unthinkable to me. But speaking strictly as a political reporter, I would say it is impossible to imagine a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress allowing the big three auto companies to collapse. I just don't think that is possible with the loyalties and the traditions and everything that has been part of the Democratic Party, at least as I've known it. And so how they deal with it is well beyond my pay grade to try to figure out. I do not know what the answer is going to be, but I do think, to put it in the terms that you did, that Obama and the Democratic Congress will have to address this issue and address it seriously. I don't think it's possible to do this in the lame duck session. I wish the answer were different, but I do not believe it is possible to do this week or next week.
Hi. In what capacity, if you were President Obama, in what capacity would you use Bill Clinton, and then in what capacity do you think President Obama will use Bill Clinton?
I've written an ill-tempered column for tomorrow arguing that it would be a big mistake for the president-elect to make Hillary Clinton his Secretary of State. Not because I don't think she would do a good job. I think she would be very effective in that job. But I think for a variety of reasons that it is not the best use of her talents, and it's not the best way for him to structure that important part of his government. And I won't force you to listen to it because it'll be in the paper probably tomorrow, and be sufficient to tomorrow is the people that will be offended by this. But Bill Clinton is a real problem. I mean, he's a challenge. He's enormously talented. He's got more energy than anybody else in the world. And what in the hell are you going to do with him? So I don't know how they deal with that, but I don't think the first step is to make her Secretary of State.
Thank you, David. The Kennedy-Nixon campaign is often cited as the one that brought out television, the importance of television in terms of electing and the influence it had in the campaign. And obviously, Obama used the media masterfully in this election, I think, to gain advantage over McCain. Can you talk about the influence of the media, whether it's good or bad, and how it affects the campaign?
Well, I don't want to give an answer as long as the first talk, but it's a big topic. Let me just take a couple of small points about it. When people talk about the media now, we are in a different era. When I started, we talked about the press and really had in mind newspapers and their coverage of politics. And now, of course, the audience has moved first to television, now to the websites and the internet and 24-hour cable news. So it's a very different media mix. In the old media, my part of the jungle, we knew what the rules were. And we were trained, all of us, to do a kind of evidence-based, fairly skeptical kind of reporting. The classic version of it was that line in the poster on the wall of the City News Bureau in Chicago said, "If you think your mother loves you, check it." And that was the tradition which my generation of reporters, and I would have to say, still, the newspaper reporters' generation, that's their ethic today as well. But it's a very different ethic now for those other new forms of media. Much more impressionistic, much more opinionated, and obviously they have developed a huge audience for that kind of journalism. The candidates have to struggle with this now, because if you went to the Obama or McCain headquarters in Chicago or Northern Virginia, what you saw was a relatively small press operation and a very large alternative media operation, because they know that's where the audience has migrated. And there are very, very few rules, as far as I can judge, for that alternative media. And it is pretty much of a jungle where smart candidates like Obama do well, and smart journalists do very well, but some of us have a hard time understanding what the rules are supposed to be. One more question.
I have
yes.
a question over here, and I have a
I'm stepping
microphone
on
too.
I'm killing the mic system.
I'm over here. I'm not as well informed, over on this side to your right.
Okay.
I'm not as well informed as the Republican thinking as I should be. Help me with Sarah Palin and whether or not it reveals a schism, a division between the intellectual heritage of the Republican Party and sort of the populist vision of the Republican Party. How do Republican conservative intellectuals view their future in the Republican Party?
Well, what I have been hearing and reading from my Republican friends, including some of the journalists whose work I admire, is a great deal of anxiety and not very much clarity as to what the next steps need to be. I think that for myself, as you heard me say before, the Republican answers lie largely today at the state level, not in Washington, D.C., not with that minority in the Senate and House. I think they are likely to be more conservative, particularly in the House of Representatives, than they were in the last Congress, and I don't think that's likely to produce a suddenly more positive public reaction there. But at the state level, they really do have lots and lots of talent. And as I think people said when the Republican governors met in Miami last week, it is only at the state level that people can actually see what Republican government would look like if the Republicans came back to power. And that's where I think they can find their best answers at the state level. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.